Welcome, everyone, to Data and the Greater Good. I see some familiar faces in the audience. I see some new faces in the audience. So we extend a warm welcome to everyone. Those of you that are familiar with us, or if you're not familiar with us, our mission at Data and the Greater Good is the use of data as it benefits humanity in mission-driven organizations, organizations that make a difference in our lives every day, be it healthcare, the arts, social justice, and a number of other areas. And organizations come in and talk to us on a roughly monthly basis about how they use data to advance their vision and their mission. And it's also a great opportunity for us as a community to learn about all the wonderful organizations here in New York City. And we're honored to have with us tonight the Executive Director of New York Cares, Gary Bagley, will talk with us about their data journey and how they're using data to advance volunteer recruitment and engagement. So as I mentioned, our focus here at Data and the Greater Good is mission-driven organizations and their use of data in advancing their vision and making New York better. And when we think of organizations that are the pinnacle of that, one of the organizations that would come to mind first is New York Cares. And we're really honored to have with us this evening the Executive Director of New York Cares, Gary Bagley, here to talk with us about data at New York Cares. To tell you a little bit more about Gary, Gary joined New York Cares in 2004, Senior Director of Programs, and was appointed to his current position in 2008 as Executive Director. While Executive Director of New York Cares, he has more than tripled volunteer service delivery, filling more than 200,000 volunteer positions on 20,000 projects that serve over 1,000 nonprofits. He's also been instrumental in times of crisis, such as Hurricane Sandy, where thousands received the volunteerism. Over 25,000 volunteer projects were staffed by New York Cares during that time. Gary has received a number of awards that include a past recipient of the New York Times Nonprofit Excellence Award, the Peter F. Drucker Award for Nonprofit Innovation. He's also been named one of the CSR Responsible 100 Leaders in the state of New York in Outstanding Social Responsibility. He is on the board of directors for Points of Light and is also on the faculty at Columbia University as well as Baruch College, where he also received an MPA. Here to talk with us about New York Cares and their use of data and volunteer engagement is Gary Bagley. Please give him a very warm welcome.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Well, hi, everybody. Thanks for being here tonight. How many people here already know New York Cares to some degree? Oh, good. That's actually one of the joys of the job. Over the last 30 years, over 250,000 individuals have volunteered their time through New York Cares. Also, how many folks might know our annual coat drive with the shivering Statue of Liberty ad that you see across the 5 boroughs? Over the course of the 30 years, we have distributed 2 million coats to New Yorkers in need. So those things are happening all the time at New York Cares. And with just the sheer number of outputs we have as an organization and the sheer number of logistics that we manage, we've always had to have a strong view of what was happening and really focused on the data. So I want to talk to you about a few things tonight. First of all, just to give you a little more sense of our scale, our mission is to meet pressing community needs by mobilizing caring New Yorkers in volunteer service. One of the things that we'll talk about tonight, and one thing that has focused our look at data over the years, is the most interesting and ever-present question for us is, what do we mean by meeting pressing community needs, right? And one of the benefits of our mission is as the needs in the city evolve, we can shift our strategies to better meet those. Our one commitment is that we will always do that by bringing volunteers into the space, by, if you will, I often compare us to a foundation, but instead of giving money, we make gifts of human capital, right? We're driving human beings into the nonprofit sector and the public schools to where it can do the most good, where they can do the most good. We have grown into being the city's largest volunteer network. This year, 52,000 individuals volunteered their time through New York Cares. You're data people, so as I often say, it's 52,000 people and we can name them. A good colleague of mine used to say everybody who walked by the front of the building was counted as a client at some point, and we work to be very precise. We drive our volunteers to three big issue areas. The first being education. This is about half of the work we do. This is everything from tutoring elementary school students on academic and enrichment subjects all the way to helping adults get either into the workforce, back into the workforce, practice English language skills. Right now, a major initiative is helping people prepare for citizenship exams. About 42% or so of the work is immediate needs. This is work that you would often associate with volunteers. It's hunger programming, visiting seniors, taking care of animals. Very important work, as I often say, though, helping us meet the most basic human needs. And then the last 8% of the work is what we call public spaces. This is beautifying parks, painting public schools. Right now we have a particular focus on community gardens and urban farming because they're really helping to build up communities, drive everything from fresh produce to stronger participation in the community in many communities around New York City. We are providing volunteer support to about 1,100 nonprofits, and at the end of the day, between the coat drive and all the different programs we served, just under 500,000 New Yorkers last year. So what we'd like to do tonight is give you a bit of an understanding of what we've been doing with data at New York Cares, how we think of that, a particular subject within our work. I'm going to take you back when I started. Elaine very nicely talked about when I started as program director. And in the program director role, one of my first efforts was to build volunteer engagement. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that base of how we started thinking about tracking engagement and measuring that. That led to two other major initiatives where I would say we used, they were data-informed initiatives, all looking at volunteer engagement. In other words, how do we get you started, then how do we get you to your second project, how long can we keep you with us, right? Incredibly important if you look at it from a customer focus. Now, we're at that point in our growth where we're saying, what's the impact on the actual communities we're serving, right? So it's good that we get more people out. It's good that people are more and more engaged in their communities. But what impact is that actually having on the community, right? Some folks will look at volunteerism in particular and say, well, that's nice. It makes Gary feel good. But does it actually help the child, right? Is it really making any change in the community? And you'll be here at the beginning of hearing tonight how we're thinking about impact on issues, communities, and to the volunteers. So that's the kind of stuff that we'll cover tonight. I often say, I've got almost a 15-year tenure at New York Cares, and I could talk for 15 years about our work. So I'm also going to depend on you to raise hands, ask questions, and make sure that I don't keep you all here till tomorrow morning. There you go. So a little bit of what we've been doing with data. The biggest thing I would say here is that when we started our work really looking at data acquisition, we were in a custom-made FileMaker database, working very, very hard, and I'll tell you a story in a minute about our leadership ladder program and our volunteer journey. But what became apparent was that if we really wanted regular access to data, we were going to need to make a couple significant moves. The first was that in 2009, we transitioned over to Salesforce, which gave us much more regular access to data. It also enabled us to, and this is very important for us, to take not only volunteer activity, but to start to look at that along with donor activity, right? Some folks give their time, some folks give their money, some folks give both, and it gives us a chance to really look at that all in one place. Up until that time, databases around fundraising and programming were very much two separate things. So we made a decision that we were going to be building our own Salesforce database that we could run off of. This allows us to capture some really some great data at pivotal moments in the volunteer journey. And you'll hear more about these as I'm speaking, but from the minute a volunteer hits our website, we're able to collect information about your interests. We have a lot of information on the demographics of our volunteers, their interests in the community. We have evaluations after every single project. There are annual surveys of all of our volunteers, as well as a subset of our volunteers who lead our programs called team leaders and our community partners. So we're getting a lot of information regularly. And then, of course, through our work in Salesforce, we're able to regularly track the amount of activity that you're doing, how long it takes you to get started with us, how long you've stayed, and some really important metrics for us. Okay, there we go. So I want to walk through a few reports, and I'm going to try to do this part quickly because this is where I could really dig in if I'm not careful. The leadership ladder is work that I did when I first started in the program role with the team in place. And our big question then, very high level, was less than half of the people who came to New York Cares to orient as volunteers went on and actually started to volunteer. So that was about 45%. Now at the time, we were orienting about 6,500 people a year. But so you can imagine about 3,400 of those folks we were orienting, and then they weren't going on to do anything. So not only inefficient, certainly, because all of these were in-person orientation, but raised serious questions about what was actually happening there. Right? In addition to that, and this is a number that's hard to budge, about a third of the people who went on and volunteered would only volunteer once and then never come back again. Right? So as a new program director, I'd been given ambitious goals, and I had the joy of going to my new boss 2 weeks later and saying, I'd like you to know I cannot meet these goals. Right? And I had shown the numbers and said, listen, if we keep up the kind of activation numbers we have from orientation and the kind of retention numbers we have, gosh, 3 years from now, I'll have to be orienting 25,000 people a year to meet these goals, up from 6,000. So I said, I think the better path, if we can start here, is getting more people who come in the door to do something. Okay? So we developed strategies for that. I won't go into those so much, but one of the things that we started to do to look at it from an evaluation perspective is we developed what's called the volunteer engagement scale. And it was 6 levels of engagement, right? And to me, this was actually one of the more powerful things that we did in the moment, was we chose to just count 3 things. And said, because by the way, as you guys know, it's like you start counting and all of a sudden you have hundreds and hundreds of things you want to know. We said, what are those 3 things we want to know? We wanted to know how much you do, right? How long you've stayed with us. And third was how much leadership you've taken within our ranks. And all of those levels were able to be operationalized into 6 levels. Level 1, by the way, in-house, we call them shoppers. Those were those people who came and never did anything. And so our goal was to get as many shoppers up to be level 1 volunteers as we could, or level 2 rather, and then level 2 and 3, etc. There is a report, if anybody's interested, I can make sure that folks have it. The good news is we went from 45% of folks activating up to about 2/3 now activate that come to orientation. And for some reason that felt fair. I don't know, like 1 out of 3 people sort of going, yeah, I'm not so sure, I'm kind of checking this out. For some reason that felt reasonable. 45% did not. We also then we're able to discover more about the motion of our volunteers, right? And one of the key findings from the leadership ladder, and one of the metrics that we still track, is the average number of times somebody volunteers in a year, right? So right now, if you will, our power users are about 20,000 people. So this year, they went from 6.5 projects per person up to 7. So you can do the math and say 10,000 of the volunteer spots we filled this year were because people did more, not because we went out to get more people, right? So we started working there, and then one of the things that happened on this leadership ladder, for what it's worth, is the strategies were lined up to say, what are the communication strategies to push you from level 1 to level 2, from level 2 to level 3? Once you get to level 4, what are we starting to do? So there were a lot of strategies, and then we stopped and we said, we need to test these, right? We're trying so many things, and we actually don't know if all of them are working, right? So we actually then had a study, still using the leadership ladder model, called Saying Thank You Matters, right? Because part of our whole hypothesis is that if I thank you at different touch points in your volunteer journey, you're more likely to continue. And so we said, well, let's test that. And so for, I believe it was a 3-month period, we had a control group of volunteers that we didn't thank, which felt cruel at the time, I'm here to admit. It didn't feel like we were denying them any medication that could save their lives, but it was something we really believed in. And I would tell you that after, I think it was a 6-month period, the people who had been thanked did 4 times more than the people who had not been thanked. So we said, okay, we'll keep thanking people. And if you want, there's a 1-page, I have a little blog post I wrote about the thank you I owe to all those folks. And I promise you, we did go back and thank them, and hopefully some of them got started again. So right away, we started really looking at this journey and how we could make a difference by keeping, as we like to say, keeping our eyes on the numbers at all time. The other big shift, and I would say for the organization, and this is, predates sort of the Salesforce days where we had more regular access to data and more dependable access, is we were also shifting our mindset from looking back and seeing what had happened last year to trying to figure out what we were going to look at every day to change what was coming up and what was happening in the future. Keep in mind, under this, there's all sorts of process metrics that we're tracking. We're tracking the average fullness of our projects at all time. If a project dips below 70% of the primary desired number of volunteers, we have strategies to reach out and try to fill it. So this is all happening every day, and that's why I always say every month 11,000 people get off their couch. They show up somewhere in the 5 boroughs to volunteer, and everything is waiting for them. So we have to be knowing where you're going, what you're waiting for, and really keeping track of that throughout your journey. Volunteer journey actually started, and I sometimes laugh about this. At the time we started our work on the leadership ladder, we really didn't know anything about you till you walked in the room for your orientation and started filling out your paper volunteer info form. And now, of course, a lot of that had moved online, right? Folks were filling in their data and giving us all sorts of info before they got to us. We could tell what they were doing on our website before they showed up in the room. And what it made clear was that the journey that used to start with us all sitting in a room together was starting much earlier. And so we went back, and the team in place was looking back at the whole journey now. So what happens when someone hits the website? How many people are actually creating an account? And then a VIF is our in-house, that's our volunteer information form, right? That's where we start to ask you your name, some of your interests, etc. So how many people are completing that VIF? You can start to see the drop-off here. Then, after they fill out the VIF, how many people actually go on and sign up to come to an orientation? You see the next big drop-off. Then how many people actually walk in the door, right? Then there's that drop-off we're talking about. How many people actually get to a project after that moment? And then after that, how many people get to their second project? So, as you look down the funnel, you can see, okay, 31,000 plus accounts created to get down to 4,600 people who will do 2 or more things, right? So question, good enough? Is this the reality of the work, right? We didn't know, right? We suspected this had to be inefficient. We had to suspect that there was a huge amount of drop-off at points where we actually didn't have the systems to be keeping in touch with people, or to step in as part of their process. So we did a bunch of surveying and testing with groups of our volunteers and new folks to our website, and we found out, and I always say no surprise, but I guess it probably was a little bit of one, when we first started. When people got to the website, they didn't actually know what to do. It wasn't 100% clear to them. So big win if we could make it just clear what is your next step. The form, this volunteer info form, was too long, and we were starting to hit an era when we were asking for too much information, right? 5 years earlier, people wanted us to know more, and tailoring, their interests to what we did was more manual. It was less so now, and so people were very aware of being asked for a lot more info than they were for other organizations. And as we know later on, at a point when they weren't even sure they were going to do this, right? And then this was the most interesting thing. After people attended the orientation, and by the way, one thing that we did not get lost on us, when you look at the number of things someone has gone through and then physically shown up for a 1-hour orientation, the fact that they didn't go on and do something seemed just absolutely dumbfounding to us, that you would put in all that work and then not come. And the biggest reason we found for the drop-off was that they forgot to register, right? Now, what we learned as an organization, and this was really important for us, is when you hit our website, it was confusing because we told you the whole thing, right? And we started to get into an era where people just wanted to know, what's the next thing I do? They didn't necessarily want to know the whole journey. They wanted to have a better understanding of the next thing to do and to make sure that was crystal clear. So we developed automated communications timeline that, first of all, started also introducing more of the organizational culture, right? One of the things that's been interesting for us in our whole journey is that your desire to give back is very personal, right? It's growing from a need to help someone else. And then what people were doing was coming to actually a relatively mechanical website, right? That was saying, do this, here are the 8 things you have to do, don't forget, 1-hour orientation, don't forget to check this box, you have to sign your policies and procedures. It wasn't really rising up to meet just the level of passion that people were bringing to the desire to do this. So developed automated, personalized emails that then would trigger reminders and let you know what to do next, wait a certain number of days if you hadn't done that, get in a reminder, start showing you what you're missing, the chance to be with other volunteers, the chance to be back out in the community, showing you impact on clients. And this was all developed based on a look at that first pipeline and all the drop-off in it. So the good news, I could show you the whole pipeline again, but the good news here is that we saw, over 8% an increase in completing that volunteer info form, and then we saw a 4% increase in the number of folks coming to orientation. So for us, that's another 150 volunteers who go out and do something. Eventually, they will average about 7 projects per person. So a little effort like this can lead to us filling about 1,000 more volunteer positions a year. So that was one of the things that we did there. Now, and I appreciate you're all staying with me, and I know they're like I'm taking you through like the entire history of the organization. So, one of the things that we're really looking at now is one of the things that I think is probably no surprise to anybody here, but what has been really shifting are the motivations of volunteers and people in general, right? Why do we give back, right? And it's important for us to keep our finger on that pulse. One thing that's unique about New York Cares, about 70% of our volunteers are between 18 and 34, which is unusual in the volunteer sector, right? So one of the things that happens are generational shifts in how we look at service, how we utilize technology. Those impact us immediately, right, as folks are coming in the door. For a variety of reasons, we're very concerned about what was motivating our volunteers right now at this moment in time. As you probably know, a lot of individuals are taking what is volunteerism, and that is extending into more political activity, a general, if you will, social justice stance on the work and how we show up in our communities, and articulated in a way that's much more direct and clear than it's ever been. And so one of our questions always is, are we staying relevant, if you will? So one bit of survey, and you'll start to see a lot of changes coming up. If you follow us, you'll start seeing a lot of changes in communication. This survey, we were looking at the motivations of our volunteers. And I can tell you, back when we did the leadership ladder, we did similar surveys. The number one motivation for folks was always to make New York City a better place to live. And that is still in there. But what is forefronted in a way that it's never been before is that I volunteer because of the values I hold, right? That volunteering is an expression of my values. You can also see, and we broke this out by borough, and I'll explain why in just a second, right? So as we're starting to see what these motivators are, fascinating one, by the way, because New York Cares is group volunteering, people always consider that like meeting people is one of the primary motivators. We're seeing it really is not for our volunteers. One thing we did discover, though, that was interesting, it's not a reason people start, but it's a reason they stay, which was interesting. So if you came to meet people, you probably didn't continue, but you continue because you met such wonderful people. So questions of motivation really matter. Interestingly, religious motivations or other required service, like for, say, you're going to school and you have a public service requirement, were very minimal. So what this does for us, of course, is then it's triggering now messages or changes in our messaging around how we motivate you to start, probably what kind of messages you will respond to. And it's also very, just as an aside, as an organization like we are, people bring whatever, political beliefs, whatever, motivations they have for volunteerism. Our goal is to make sure anyone who wants to give back can in the community. And so as an organization, we've kind of stayed away from espousing any value other than we should give back in our communities, right? And so really starting with the last presidential election, we've been able to be more direct about, what people see in this community or what they're seeing in their communities, and how they might want to change it without stating an opinion on whether it's right, wrong, whatever it may be. But we're actually able to start activating more on people's values. Other thing that we're seeing a lot of, and this, by the way, absolutely mirrors what's happening in the workforce. which is our volunteers actually want to gain greater understanding of the issues through their volunteer service. And this, by the way, is noticeably different from older volunteers, right, who, want to give back. They don't necessarily think of learning about the issue area as being a motivation. They do see it as a tangential benefit of having done it, but they don't need it to be a learning experience, right? And so the same way we're seeing a desire in the workforce for more professional development, more learning experiences in the office, folks are also looking for there to be more learning experiences through their service experience. And now our programmatic question is going to be, how do we rise up to meet that? And that'll be coming up in a moment. Just mentioned here, right, values were the most highly rated motivation, and religious and career were actually lowest, which we find interesting. And as we think about expanding around New York City, one of the things we want to be mindful of is there's a very, very rich culture of service in most religious communities. And to think about how our work, can either function alongside of that, complement it to figure out how we serve all communities fully is a big question for us. Great. State of the volunteers. This is a report we do every year. It's looking at the engagement, all those engagement metrics we've talked about before, the demographics, as we're watching against our strategy to see how that's moving the demographics of our volunteer base, their sentiments, and their beliefs. Back up, one other thing we've been doing this entire 10 years that I didn't mention, but when I got to New York Cares, about 75 to 80% of our programming was on the island of Manhattan. We were in New York City, we were an organization founded by Manhattanites, right? Manhattan is the most convenient borough for transportation, easier to start programs. The reality is we also knew when we talk about meeting pressing community needs, that we weren't necessarily in all the communities that needed us. So what's happened over the last 10 years was we went from being about 75 to 80% on the island of Manhattan. Now all the programming tripled, but now Manhattan is down to 36% of the work as we started, as I always say, marching across the bridges and swimming across the rivers and trying to really serve all 5 boroughs and trying to meet the need there. So one of the things that came up with that is, of course, as we're doing that, the volunteer base also becomes more diverse, right? Reflecting the communities we're serving. We also start to discover that there are certain communities that we're not good at serving, right? So because of some of those base data that we do track around project fullness, we can watch and say, where do you live? Where did you go? Right? So we can start to see, people, 70% of the people who live in Queens will volunteer in Queens. We can start to see that, right? But what we did see was that there were certain neighborhoods that it was very, very hard for us to get fullness. Our average fullness, by the way, is about 90%. So if we need 10 volunteers on a project, overall we've got 9, right? South Bronx, Central Brooklyn, Eastern Queens, that number was 6 or 7. Now, as I always like to say, 6 people reading to kids in Eastern Queens is not a bad thing, but we wanted 10, right? And so the question was, how do we get the 10 there? And this started to really show us that, as I always say, our methods were sort of shock and awe, right? We did everything. We threw everything at the wall. We saw what stuck. Our volunteers were opting in. It was a pull system where people were searching and saying, I want to read to kids. Here's when I'm free. And then they were showing up where they wanted to go. So then the question was, well, how are we going to really start pushing people to these particular, what we called focus neighborhoods? Okay? And that's going to set the stage for a couple things I'll almost end with in a few minutes. So I want to back up and make sure to tell you that. This is something where if you can get a good look at it. It is just telling us so much. Actually, can I have a time check? Have I been already talking for an hour?
About 5 more minutes.
Okay, great. So, thing I'll show you here is that what we started to look at the volunteers is say, why are you doing this, right? What's motivating you? And then to what degree do you perceive New York Cares as doing that, right? And so one of the things that we're starting to see around the state of the volunteers is that, for instance, racial justice is a major motivator for why people are coming, but there is a less of a perception that that is something that somebody can do through New York Cares, or that you can affect a change there. So one of our jobs, because by the way, our work can cover almost all of these areas, so part of the messaging that we're going to be looking at now is how to bring those two together, okay? Now, I've gone on way too long on some of the early stuff. That's all things I just said, so we're good there. What I do want to let you know very quickly is right now, as you could probably hear, our work is pretty output driven, meaning, how many people are going, tracking fullness rates, et cetera. And we're starting to look at deeper sense of engagement in the community and a sense of impact. There are a couple ways we're doing that. Right now, we're building out data on how volunteers can meaningfully impact the most important issues. We've done that by identifying impact partnerships. One quick example. We went to a collection of our schools. One of their biggest issues they face are English language learners. Right? Folks are coming in, they're not familiar with English language, and if they do not get up to grade level by 3rd grade, it's very, very, very hard after that to get somebody caught up. So about 5 million English language learners in the US, 94% of ELL students test non-proficient on state assessments. Okay, so what we're going to be doing this year is, we have 5 schools, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yes, 5 schools where we now have data sharing agreements, right? We're going to be bringing in programming targeted at English language learners, working with our volunteers, and we're now going to be able to track and say, do those students have a better trajectory than students who are not getting this added support, right? Our hope is across the schools that we will start to find those interventions that work, and then that gives us the ability using that data to then scale whatever interventions are working best across hundreds of other schools that we're working with. So this is where we're starting to talk about greater impact. We're also going to be looking to understand specifically how volunteerism helps neighborhoods. We're working with a capstone team from Columbia, and they're going to help us identify actual community health metrics that we can track and that we can relate to volunteerism. So, and finally, always, we're going to be looking for the increased benefit to volunteers of doing this work. One thing that makes volunteerism powerful is it is good for the communities you serve and it is good for you. Both things are true. And so from a mission perspective, we are now committed to showing that we're benefiting the community and we're benefiting the volunteer, and then hopefully together those two pieces together make for an even more powerful social services. All righty. Thank you, everybody.
Gary, thank you so much for that comprehensive overview. We want to open it up for Q&A now. Yes.
Maybe I know less about this than other people, so maybe everybody knows the answer to this, but I was just a little bit confused about your organization.
Yeah.
How is it funded? And it seemed like you do 2 separate things, organizing volunteers for many different types of activities in many different volunteer organizations, and also organizing your own activity like the Coat Drive.
Right.
And the main question was really, in a given organization, which is a volunteer organization and therefore is not a profit-making. How does the impetus arise to actually utilize your services to broaden the base and increase the efficiency of the turnaround and all that kind of thing, as opposed to in a corporate structure where obviously they're looking for profit, so
Right.
it's obvious.
Yeah, the nonprofit sector, you know, I always say the big difference is that we don't raise our money by selling a service, we raise it on a promise to do something. So there are three big funding streams for us. About 50% of the revenue that comes into New York Cares is through corporations. One benefit of sponsorship to New York Cares is that we will also plan customized volunteer experiences for employees, and that's been driving a lot of companies to fund us. We also have a board of directors, and they are remarkably generous, and they work very, very hard. They raise almost $2 million a year through special events and reaching out to their friends. So we also then get a fair amount of money, but smaller, from just individuals who send us $20 at the end of the year because they believe in our good work. Also foundations. I would say one of the bigger strategies also that underlies this better definition of impact is that two communities that respond most to messages of impact are foundations and individuals, right? And those are actually our two smallest revenue streams. So there is a question of when we get better at this, which we should do for a mission purpose, just to be better at what we do, will that also possibly generate more revenue from individuals and foundations as well?
Do you identify organizations that you think that you can help and then solicit them as customers, or is there some kind of a foundation that funds you to do that for particular organizations, or does it come from the organization itself that seeks you out?
Yes.
Okay.
All three have happened. I would say most of our partners have come to us because they heard about New York Cares, just the way a volunteer knows to come to us to volunteer. Word starts to travel around schools and nonprofits. They'll call us about seeing if our volunteers can come there. I would say we're at a point where we've been so responsive that one of the realizations we're having is that if we really want to deepen this, rather than giving 10 schools each one morning of reading, it's probably better for us to give one school 10 interventions and really be able to talk about that impact and then raise the money to scale that depth of service. The only other thing I'd add is that when we were proactively working to get to other boroughs, then we actively were recruiting partnerships because word of mouth wasn't necessarily in Queens, that nobody dreamt volunteers would go to Corona to read to their kids through New York Cares, and we had to get there and prove that to folks. So, good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question, Gary, actually.
Oh, good.
I'm one of those volunteers,
You
as
are,
you know.
yes.
And it seems the demographic and the sites that I've been to is very well-educated demographic. Many have been to very elite institutions. Many, the 18 to 35 demographic that you mentioned, very mission-driven, but very privileged group, is my impression.
Yes.
And do you find all neighborhoods equally receptive to that demographic?
What a great question. And this was one of the things I didn't have a chance to talk about, because one thing that's interesting in the data we've been looking at is 10 years ago, about 30% of our volunteers identified as people of color. That's now up to 40%. So there was, within that, a presumption that we were better serving volunteers in the neighborhoods. It turned out we were not. That the overall base of the volunteers was, I think the average income level was $70,000, highly employed, highly educated. So that as we were working to diversify the volunteer base, we were only in some regards. One of the big initiatives we're in the middle of now, and we're building the systems out, we got a big grant from a foundation called Booth Ferris. And part of our meeting the interests of our volunteers is also, from an equity perspective, starting to recognize the implications of showing up in a neighborhood where you're not familiar with the community. You have, of course, your heartfelt desire to do good, but through New York Cares, you will probably interface with a community that you're not familiar with people who are living an experience you have not lived. And it's also our job now to push forward and make sure that that is as respectful in interaction as possible. So the systems that we're going to be building out are going to be automated communications that not only contextualize your service for you before you go. For instance, if you were going to PS 18X, you might get an email to tell you a little bit about the school, a little bit about the community it resides in. This is also a chance for us to start bringing in what we call asset-based communication, right? A lot of us are driven to help others because their lives are so horrible, right? And when you're going into that public school, there is a public school of parents who want it to be a better school for their kids, right? So how do we make sure that before you go in, that you're entering with a desire to lift up the work that's already happening in that community, not fix it? So there will be communications on the front end, and then on the back end, when you're done, not only will there be a chance to evaluate the experience from your perspective, but we're going to be pushing for what I would call more reflection kind of activities that will hopefully encourage you not just to go back to that school, but to better understand the issues that underlie everything you saw. Very quickly, I would say that, when we go to work in education, it can be a very disappointing experience the first time people do it. Right? Because we all imagine we've seen too many movies. We think we go read once and the child jumps up and they're on their way to college somehow, right? And it doesn't really happen, right? And that can be a really, really hard experience to process because sometimes you go in and you think, well, this child has reading problems. And then you're also starting to bump up against questions about nutrition, right? About the lack of physical activity that they may have in their day. Questions about employment of parents, right? Are the parents able to support using their language skills at home, like many of us take for granted, right? That moment can be very overwhelming, right? A simple desire to read to a child can then all of a sudden become an overwhelming issue. So we're trying to figure out how we can also inform and educate there.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions? Do you need this?
Oh, it's okay.
Okay.
I was just curious what data you use to identify the needs part of it, or like geographically where the needs are, or what the needs are.
It's a great question. We use, and we've struggled around this, right? Because New York City is a high need city, and it is unlike other cities in that, the need is not localized as much. But we do use the statistics, any poverty-related statistics for neighborhoods. In terms of schools, we rely on data like free and reduced lunch. We also are starting to focus on school districts that we know are particularly struggling. So those are a few that we're using right now.
My question is, what can we do as attendees to help you with your data-driven initiative, whatever that might be?
That's a wonderful question. One of the things, I was talking to Elaine before, and we got working together a little bit on this because in the fall, New York Cares hired, as part of this whole communications initiative, we hired our first UX lead. And so we're getting a much better sense of what we're going to be needing and the kind of help that would help us there. So one thing I would say is if you want to get me contact info, or if we want to get, if there's a way to exchange info, I'd love to update folks because there will be things that we need and we'll probably know in the next couple of months what those would be. I'm very grateful. There was one here, Zoe, and then Bill.
So I just had a quick question. You mentioned that more and more volunteers are interested in social justice.
Yes.
I was wondering if you find it hard to maintain a politically neutral stance, and if so, what do you end up saying no to, and how do you decide those tough calls?
Great question. Is it harder and harder? Yes, yes, yes. One thing we, by the way, found out with our volunteers is even in a remarkably liberal city, our volunteers are remarkably liberal. Like they track liberal against New York City, which is a hard thing to do. So I was laughing because I didn't think that was possible, but we did it. So one of the things we've learned, the way we navigate that is, and actually the what I'll call the crisis at the border with children being separated from parents, right? That was a moment in time where our volunteers were coming and saying, we want to do something, right? We actually now have a whole little flow chart of how we think about this, meaning like, can we actually do something? If so, then we follow one trajectory. If we care about it, but we can't do anything, what do we do? And on that one, what we did do, and it was one of the ones that worked, I think we sort of threaded the needle right, which we came and we said, we're reading the news also, we're very upset about it. We also would like to be doing something, but New York Cares is, deferring to groups at the border. We actually gave people, said these are some good groups that are directly involved. But if you want to impact change on this kind of issue every day, here's what you can do in the city you love, right? And we pushed people toward our work in citizenship and adult education, and we saw a tripling, I believe it was, in signups for those kind of programs. So the way we do it is sort of acknowledge and then drive to what you can do in this community. One of the things we'll be watching on that communications that I was talking about before is we really do want to see, if you start to understand the issues you're volunteering on better, will we see other forms of civic engagement step up, right? Because volunteerism is sort of one leg in the stool. There's voting, there's consuming news, there's voting, and will we see those kind of behaviors increase or other kinds of political activity? I will say we will joyfully watch in the background while it happens. Good question, by the way.
Am I on? Can you hear that? My question has to do with board leadership. Do they use data to make decisions?
Oh boy, do they. They're from the finance industry. So every once in a while, I'm like, I want somebody to tell a story with a little heart in it here. But no, they're very data-driven, and as a matter of fact, the leadership ladder work, the volunteer journey work, that's all been brought up at board meetings for board members to better understand our primary customer, which is our volunteer, understanding what's motivating them, how the organization is adapting to better enable people to volunteer. So very much data-driven, and really, I should say, we're lucky. Almost every one of our board members met us because they were volunteering with us, whether that was through their company or individually. And so there's also a strong passion for the mission, luckily, that lies under that.
Is there some kind of overlap between the memberships so that it's kind of like Facebook, friends who signed up, other people, or that there could be loss of some members of one organization who will move over, who will see that you have as a client another organization that catches their eye and maybe they would prefer to volunteer there, or are they completely disconnected? And the second question is, there certainly must be a great temptation to use this data, to sell this data, you know so much. Is there some kind of corporate aspect of profit making? And number three, which is entirely different, I set up an organization a long time ago, and one of the things I found, for example, there was a fall off of certain people, and it turned out that it was due to the emotionally wrenching nature of the encounter. And so it would be interesting to hear from you, what were the most unexpected reasons for people stopping to volunteer?
Wow. So three very different questions, and I'm admitting I already forgot the first one. The second, the first is, do we see sort of crossover? I think, as...
Who are members of one of your client organizations,
right,
also see the other organizations who are your clients.
My guess is that happens, but not in an intentional way through us. One of the things that we're talking about through this community approach is what we would love to have happen is to have And these are some of the ways we're picking these schools. These are schools that are all near the shelter system, so they have a high percentage of students who also identify or are in transition or identify as homeless. They're also near community gardens, right? And they're also near senior centers. So we're starting to look to say, can we connect the resources in the community? Because very often, New York Cares is working in all of these organizations, but they're not necessarily all working with each other. The second question, yes, data and selling it. We don't. But, no, I think, good idea. No, I think, one of the ethical questions we've had over the years is, as you can imagine, a lot of companies wouldn't mind getting out to 200,000 folks, 70% of whom are 18 to 34. So that's been everything from free beer at our happy hour to we're questioning where else there might be brand alignment. Especially in sponsorships of certain kinds of programming. I know I'm going to hold off on your last question because I know you had a question and I think we have like 1 minute left, right?
We have time for one more question.
Okay, and then I can talk to you after about your third.
Okay, thank you. You alluded mid-presentation to a time when you kind of shifted from using data to kind of reflect back versus
Yes.
Using data to look forward and say how we're going to use this to what we did tomorrow. So
Yes.
I've found in my experience in nonprofits getting stuck quite a bit in the looking back. So I was looking for some insight from you, like how do you get people to look forward?
I always say grab them by the head and turn them around. It's hard. I would say, I was actually talking to our program director about it, saying, I always appreciate a good analysis of why something didn't work, but I really would like to have been talking about this 2 months ago and be somewhere in the middle of the solution. So one of the things that I'm finding, and this was the challenge, and I'd love to stay in touch and talk about it, one of them is to say, what are just, this was also the big lesson of the leadership ladder, what are just 2 or 3 things we can count that are forward-looking, right? That force us to do our jobs to look ahead, right? If you couldn't get your job done without looking forward, you'd look forward, right? So from a management perspective, I believe we've created a place where people don't have to look forward to be a success. So right now we're trying to identify a few of those, and then I think the other strategy, and we're in the middle of fixing this right now, is we tend to, with data, and I'm sure you guys are all used to this, is you just keep adding more things that you count, right? And all of a sudden one day you're buried in it and you're counting the things that actually don't matter the most and missing the things that do. So I've asked for what are those 3 forward-looking things, and then I've asked for 5 things we can stop counting. Sort of, put them to bed, bury them, have a little ceremony, and all start looking forward. So that's a very general answer, but thinking about fullness, thinking about partnership development, thinking about deeper outcomes that will require me to plan on the way in. So, sure.
Gary, thank you so much.
Oh, sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. And I can send you some information. If you're interested in volunteering for New York Cares, you can go to their website, or we can also connect you to Gary if you wish to continue the conversation.
Perfect.
And thank you all for joining us this evening, and we hope to see you back next month for the 92nd Street Y. They're going to talk to us about all the wonderful programs that are made possible by the beauty of data. Thank you all.
Great. Thank you.